people to find out where the local castle had been, who made this terrible mistake because historians are fallible too, because historians are as subject to their prejudices, fantasies, wishful thinking, and psychologies as anyone else is. Perpetrators, victims, neighbors, survivors, witnesses. So there, in the 1960s and 2000s, are a couple of stories about unreliable witnesses and flawed narrators. When I started to write about what I had always thought would be a fairly simple story, these recurring worries about reliability led me to worry further about a different problem. What is the relationship of the flawed witness to the flawed historian, of lived life to history with a capital H? The afternoon I made my final plea to crusty old Meg Grossbard in Sydney to grant me an interview, standing in a phone booth on a busy street, arguing and cajoling, she said to me two things that, of all the things I heard during the 5 years of researching and traveling and writing my book, have stuck most deeply in my mind. I don't want to tell you my story, she said, because if I tell you my story, it will become your story. This brilliant observation is, of course, true, and is, I think, the first thing we need to remember about the writing of history, even of small personal histories like the one I wrote. The historian is not transparent, and the story that you get is, in the end, above all, the story that the historian decides to tell you, decides will edify or entertain you. After all, did I not just tell you Meg's story, even the parts she wanted to suppress, and did you not in some way enjoy it? The second thing that Meg said that day was this: you think that you deserve to know all this because it's history. I could practically hear her voice at the other end of the phone, making little inverted commas around the word history. She went on, but this wasn't history to me, it was my life. And while I live, it belongs to me. I want to end tonight with this question of narrative property. As we know, as soon as someone like me writes down a story like hers, we are at the first step in the long process of both narrative and historiographical repossession. Repossession of the personal by the historical, of the facts by narrative. This process in itself inevitably endangers the facts, I think, whatever they may be, and we know how problematic that is. Each successive telling eliding some participant's point of view, eroding this or that detail, until the whole story becomes vaguely but irremediably altered, the way the true identity of the key word in the old children's game of telephone eventually becomes unrecognizable through too much repetition and too much handling. This process has indeed already begun to happen in the case of my book, The Lost. I know too well how the book that I wrote as a family history, and that is now often promoted as a Holocaust history, a book that will now become part of the official record of what happened during World War II, itself represents a tenth, a 20th of the research that I did and the knowledge I gathered of the stories and histories and lies that I gleaned over so many years. Only I know that the definitive history is in fact only a partial history, because no book could ever be written that could tell the whole story. Every history, every story of what happened is necessarily edited, necessarily shaped, smaller than what happened. And all such stories, as time passes, which it inevitably and relentlessly does, get smaller and smaller. With that perhaps melancholy thought in mind, it does seem worthwhile to end tonight by speculating on the future of the history of the Holocaust, about who will be the ultimate victor, so to speak, in the competition between lived witness and historians, between the memories of the event itself and the official narratives that are, at least in part, necessarily based on those memories. How will it be told? People occasionally ask me. This tale which is so enormously important, and indeed so enormous. How can we keep it alive, maintain its largeness and world historical significance, those of us who write such histories, and those who love to read them? When I respond to such questions, I have to respond as a classicist, someone who has spent a lifetime studying ancient cultures, and who, for that reason, likes to think he knows how to take a very long view of things. To think about our Holocaust story as it will be not 50 years from now, or even 100, which is nothing to a classicist, but let's say 1,000 or 2,000 years. The same amount of years, in fact, that separates Jews today from another once enormous catastrophe, another period of unbearable horror, which, when it was taking place, was the worst thing that had ever happened to the Jewish people, the enslavement in the land of Egypt. We today, like me when I was a little boy and didn't possess the proper perspective, didn't, because of who I was and where I stood in time, understand the significance of what and who was around me. We today are too close to the Holocaust to assess the future of its telling, try as we might. But I wonder if 2 millennia from now, the story of the Holocaust, all those hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of books that have so far, in the very short space of 7 decades, already been written, a vast amount of witness, documents, narratives, and stories of what happened in which my own seemingly big book is just a grain of sand. I wonder if all that will not, in the inevitable course of things, have been eroded into one story, into, as it were, a new kind of Haggadah, a story of perhaps 2 hours' length at the most in the telling, one in which all the details, the memories of individual people and acts, will have been reduced to a few high points, to the bare bones of an instructive tale. To us, it seems appalling to say so, precisely because there is still so much living memory today, still survivors to whom it was their story, their lives. But time always wins out, and history in the end is inevitably what's left. 2,000 years from now, the few known facts about my cousin Lorca Yeager, and indeed the few facts about me, the author of a book about her and the others, will have disappeared altogether, replaced by a useful cultural narrative that the Jews of the future will perhaps tell once a year as they sit down to a ritual yearly repast. And perhaps that's as it should be. The people of the future, after all, will need room to live their own lives and have their own histories. Histories inflected, of course, by what they learn about their past from people like those of us who are gathered here this evening. Professors, scholars, students, journalists, relatives, survivors, and writers. Whether you agree with this perhaps controversial forecast is something that we can discuss ourselves over a ritual repast of our own. Thank you. I'll repeat the questions back.
Yeah. I wonder how you felt about Primo Levi's idea of the gray zone. You hear about Clara's husband being a Jewish policeman doing these terrible things. Primo Levi's comment is we need to think about these things, but none of us have the authority to judge because of the horror.
Well, the question is about what Primo Levi calls the gray zone, which is the moral zone of people acting in ways that seem unimaginable to us, but who are operating under forces and circumstances that are hard for us to replicate, and created the decisions they made. And most of the people operating in the Holocaust are operating in a gray zone. I mean, it's very much a concern of mine in my book, because as I constantly say, I'm not going to judge. I don't feel I'm in a position to judge the actions of Bumo Grossbard, or, a famous example of this is members of the Judenrat, right? People who were, to some extent, forced to collaborate with the occupiers in order to deliver up certain numbers of people for deportation. People acted in ways that seemed at the time necessary, and had to do terrible things. A different example, which is even more problematic than the Judenrat example or the Jewish police example. Look, Clara Freilich's husband, clearly thought that if he joined the Jewish police, or you couldn't say no if you were chosen, right? It wasn't, but if he did this, he could save his newlywed wife, and that's what he did. So I'm not going to sit in my apartment on the Upper West Side eating Chinese takeouts like that bad boy. He should have been, I just don't think I could do that. That's not necessarily an answer, because a better person than I could make the judgment. Look, often, a story you often hear when you get, and I can't emphasize enough, I am not a Holocaust historian. I just happen to back into this stuff because I was writing a family story, but a story that is often one I heard is women smothering their own babies. Happened all the time, right? Because the crying of the babies was giving away the hiding place. People were hiding behind walls and attics and cellars. So how do you judge that one, right? So I think I am very much sensitive to that issue, and I think if Primo Levi had a problem with it, who was a participant in this event, an object of these terrible energies, then how is Daniel Mendelsohn going to pass judgment? God can pass judgment, maybe, but that's I don't think that's a cop-out to say that. I just don't know. I'll tell you a story. When I was doing my book tour, we were talking a lot about, a big thing that comes up in my book is the neighbors, the Gentile neighbors, some of whom collaborated in a very terrible way. But, as one of my survivors told me, every Jew who survived because they were being hidden by a Gentile neighbor. So there's another, you can't, it's all a gray zone. Right? And a woman in the audience stood up and she said, "Oh, well, you seem so nice, and I'm sure that if you were the Gentile neighbor and the Germans came knocking at the door and said, 'Where are the Jews?' you wouldn't tell them, even if they held a gun to your head." And I laughed, and I said, the problem is that they were holding a gun to my child's head, right? If it were so easy and obvious, the moral decisions would be clear-cut. If I have to choose between my Jewish neighbors and my child, then it's a lot more complicated, right? So whenever you think, an inevitable part, I think, of coming close to the Holocaust as an event, which I did because I was just close to talking to these people and getting this family story, so it was all very intense and personal, is you can't stop playing moral what-if games. Once you hear these stories, you have to, as an intelligent person, start thinking, what would I do? And people always say, how did this book affect you in the long run? I'll tell you how. Every time I stand on the subway platform, I look at people and I think, is this a betrayer? Is this a savior? Is that, everyone thinks they know who they are until the moment. Because, I tell you, the collaborators, the Ukrainian collaborators who threw Jewish children off of balconies and bashed their heads against walls went to church on Sunday and yelled at their children for not doing their homework, right? Nobody knows until the last minute. So I only believe in the gray zone. That's the answer. Cues? Yes, sir.
I have a question that I'd like a response to, which is I found enormously absorbing the whole book, but I would only address one point which I found problematic. As a Holocaust educator, I'm often concerned that I'm not titillating or dining out on the dead, so to speak. And your treatment of Fridke, to me, has to be looked at by some criteria to know if this was really a respectful treatment. We have Fridke in your book. You listen to all these different versions. Maybe she was a butterfly. Maybe she slept around. Maybe she was pregnant by the local non-Jewish Catholic boy. you said, well, we don't know.
Mhm.
Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't.
Mhm.
And there are three criteria I think that we have to look at this phenomenon, this presentation of yours in the book to see, is this a fair thing to do? By Jewish standards, I mean, too bad you skipped the bar mitzvah classes. But I think that it's an important Jewish value that one, we respect the dead, we treat them with great gentleness because they can't defend themselves. And two, we don't spread malicious gossip, especially about people who can't defend themselves. So we have Fridka, and I have to imagine, what would Fridka say? I always say, what would the 6 million say if they could hear me? Would I feel ashamed to be saying what I'm saying in front of them? And wouldn't Fridka say, well, it's not enough that I was killed and that my family was killed and I was thrown in the pit. You take me out 70 years later, and you say, well, maybe she was a slut, maybe she wasn't. Who knows? We'll never know. Then, when you're done, we go back in the pit, and we're all the readers of your book are mystified. Well, gee, I don't know about that, Fridka. Maybe she was a woman of, where is her honor? Her morals have been tarnished, impugned, and no one's there to defend her. I thought that this was, you're so sensitive to respect the confidence of people who say this is not for your book, and I appreciate that. And yet, here we have Fridka, now a woman of questionable honor, because various shop-worn rumors have been said by various people, and you've repeated them in your book. I somehow feel that, would we do this about the people?
Thank you. I think
would we do this about the people at the twins? Would you write a book and say, here's a woman, maybe she slept around, maybe she was...
Okay, I understand your point, so thank you. First of all, if I think that if you think that to be described in print as having been a flirt in high school is an impugnment of her honor, then I have a very different notion. And if she slept with this boy during the occupation, well, I don't think, well, we just maybe have different sexual values, you know. I think any humane person understanding the circumstances, this boy died for her, so clearly it was a serious relationship. And you know what? It never occurred to me that anyone would even think of this as an impugnment of her honor, because she's such a remarkable character, and that's what a careful reading of the book reveals, is what a vibrant and remarkable, and you know, I say over and over, she's the one everyone remembers. She's so I think, A, we have just a different notion of what that means. B, I have to say that I think I'm more respectful of her if I give her back the reality of her life and what other people saw her as, whether it's right or wrong, than to suppress, yet again, the personality that was snuffed out during the war, good or bad. I think it's more disrespectful to repress the so-called bad stuff. The whole point of the book is to revive the memory, the real lived memory of people in all of their flawed complexity, than to just, you know, make a Hallmark Valentine and say, oh, weren't they all wonderful? I think you're killing them twice if you take away their specificity, their naturalness. And the fact is, the other thing that I think I'm respecting by writing the book in the way that I wrote it is the principle of the truth. You know, I can't say what she was, but I can say what people said they thought she was. And if the reader is not intelligent enough or perceptive enough to understand that these are just small town neighborhood
Gossips.
it's not even gossip. I mean, you know, it wasn't malicious. Nobody was being malicious. And I just disagree. I just totally disagree. But I was certainly not going to spend 5 years and 500 pages saying how wonderful Uncle Shmuel and his family was. I don't think Uncle Shmuel would want me to do that, and I'm positive about that. You know, these are people. The whole point is that they were extinguished in the way that they were, and therefore anything that you can retrieve does honor not only to them, but to the whole process of what real respect for people's memory is. If, you know, I just totally disagree with you. I totally disagree with you about that. You know, bad things about my own family come out in this book. And, you know, that's it's just, the book is about what it means to search for the truth of something, good, bad, or ugly, you know. And everything I've heard about Fricka suggests to me that she would have just smiled. So I have to disagree with you. Other views? Yes?
I actually felt the exact opposite about Fritka. Reading the book, I kind of aligned with that line specifically. Being a girl in high school who was accused of being a slut for being very flirtatious and for interacting with a lot of guys in my high school career. So personally, and I mean, no disrespect to your comment, of course. It was one of the aspects of which I connected with the text, so I really appreciated that little tidbit of it, not tidbit, but her presentation. But to another question that I wanted to ask, one of the things that came up in our senior seminar course when we read your book was your use of presentation of your story within the 5 books of Torah. And I was kind of hoping if you could maybe reflect on your personal purpose, because we had a lot of theories as to why you would do that, but it would be really interesting to hear why.
That's easy. Well, so first of all, it wasn't originally part of the plan of the book. What happened was when I was writing the second part, which is about this discovery of these letters, which was a big impetus to writing the book. And, you know, here's another instance of, you know, the book describing in a possibly negative way my own relative. So, you know, we had all these letters from Shmuel to my grandfather, and we didn't know what my grandfather wrote back, whether he sent him the money, helped him, whatever. Nor will we ever know. I can make educated guesses based on what I know about my grandfather, but it's unknowable, which is